They came with power, nations, armies, sanctions, and schemes, all trying to crush a people, a culture, a spirit. They believed that sheer force could break Iran's backbone, that walls and weapons could silence centuries of faith and courage. But what they didn't realize is that some things can't be destroyed. Some nations aren't built on sand or steel. They're built on faith, on resilience, and on a will that refuses to bend. Today, we dive deep into the story of a nation that faced the world's fiercest storms and stood tall, never kneeling, never breaking. Stay with me till the very end, because this is more than history. It's a lesson in strength, spirit, and the power of believing in something greater than yourself. The story of Iran is not just the story of a country. It is the story of resistance against empires that believed they could bend a nation to its will. From the moment oil was discovered in Iran, foreign interests began circling like vultures. They didn't see a proud people or a deep-rooted civilization. They saw profit, control, and power. In 1953, when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh dared to nationalize the country's oil and take it out of Western hands, it wasn't long before global powers responded. The CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup that toppled him and reinstalled the Shah, a ruler more aligned with their economic and political agenda. It was the first major warning to the world: step out of line and you will be crushed. But Iran didn't forget. The pain of that betrayal planted the seed of defiance deep in the hearts of its people. When the Islamic Revolution erupted in 1979, it wasn't just about religion. It was about reclaiming dignity. It was about saying, we decide who we are, not you. The West lost its strong man in the Shah, and suddenly the new Iran was labeled a threat, not because of its weapons, but because of its independence. And from that day forward, everything was aimed at crushing it again. Sanctions followed, isolation followed, military threats, diplomatic pressure, cyber attacks, and covert sabotage, all tools in the arsenal of those who believed they could break Iran without firing a shot. But it didn't work, because what they misunderstood was that Iran had learned to endure pain. It had learned to breathe under pressure. And more importantly, it had rediscovered a spiritual backbone that no sanction could freeze and no drone could target. The strategy to weaken Iran wasn't always bombs or warheads. It was economic warfare. It was psychological operations. It was turning the world against it, choking its access to medicine, technology, and trade. The plan was to make life so unbearable that the people would turn against their own government, rise up, and dismantle the revolution from within. But instead, the opposite happened. The nation adapted. It improvised. It built its own industries, trained its own scientists, and raised a generation that didn't know dependency, only determination. The world tried to crush Iran, not once, not twice, but again and again. Yet every time it stumbled, it stood back up. Slower, maybe, but stronger, sharper, more prepared. And that kind of resilience doesn't come from weapons. It comes from belief, from history, from a people who know who they are and who refuse to kneel even when the weight of the world is pressing down on their shoulders. The Iran-Iraq War wasn't just a military conflict. It was a test of Iran's very soul. When Saddam Hussein launched his invasion in 1980, backed quietly and sometimes openly by Western and Arab powers, the world believed Iran would collapse within weeks. The country was fresh out of a revolution, its military weakened, its command structure in chaos, and its economy under stress. On paper, Iran looked vulnerable, but what they couldn't measure on paper was the power of faith, the spirit of martyrdom, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth dying for. Iraq had more tanks, more planes, better intelligence, and international support. Iran had young boys with barely any training, men in sandals instead of boots, and a nation that had been isolated by the global community. But what Iran lacked in equipment, it made up for in heart. The streets of Tehran, Qom, Isfahan, and Mashhad were filled with volunteers, not forced conscripts, but believers, ready to defend their soil even if it meant marching into fire with no gun in hand. These were sons, fathers, and students who believed that dying in defense of their homeland was not just heroic, it was sacred. For 8 long years, Iran stood alone against a coalition of forces. Saddam used chemical weapons on the battlefield and on civilian populations. Western nations sold him the components. The world remained silent. The United Nations hesitated to even call it out. But Iran kept fighting. Towns were destroyed, cities bombed, and children buried in mass graves. But the Iranian flag never fell. In fact, something unexpected happened. The war, instead of breaking Iran, welded it together. The chaos of the revolution turned into unity. The fractures became bonds. The battlefield became a crucible in which a new identity was forged, one rooted in sacrifice, endurance, and divine purpose. Iran's resistance during that war became a national legacy. Those who lived through it carried its scars with pride. Those born after it inherited stories not of defeat, but of perseverance. And even today, that war shapes Iran's strategic thinking, its political language, and its culture. It taught the country that survival isn't given, it's earned through blood, grit, and belief. Iran didn't just survive the war, it emerged with a spirit that told the world, you can bomb our cities, but you will never break our will. That kind of strength doesn't come from missiles or tanks, it comes from faith. And when faith becomes your armor, no army on earth can make you kneel. Economic sanctions are often referred to as a silent war. No bullets, no bombs, but the damage cuts just as deep. Over the past 4 decades, Iran has been one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. The intent was clear: choke the economy, isolate the country, and apply so much pressure that the government would either collapse or submit to foreign demands. Bank after bank was blacklisted, oil exports were slashed, trade was suffocated, and the Iranian rial lost value year after year. Medicine became scarce, basic goods grew expensive, and inflation skyrocketed. Yet, through all of this, Iran did not fall to its knees. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The nation learned how to survive with its back against the wall. Sanctions were designed to break the spirit of the people, but Iranians did what they've done for thousands of years. They adapted. Farmers found new ways to produce with limited resources. Scientists and engineers developed homegrown technology to replace imports that were banned. Universities became centers of innovation, building knowledge that once came from abroad. In many ways, Iran turned inward and discovered a resilience it didn't even know it had. The hardships forged a mentality of self-reliance, a culture of resourcefulness, and a deep pride in defying the odds. It wasn't easy. Sanctions hurt the most vulnerable. Families struggled, businesses closed. Hope was tested. But while many outside Iran thought that pressure would cause the people to turn against their government, the opposite often happened. Foreign pressure only deepened national unity. The hardship was no longer just economic, it became personal. Every time a child couldn't get medicine because of a banned shipment, every time a student couldn't access software or tools due to restrictions, the pain turned into defiance. The people weren't just surviving sanctions, They were enduring injustice. Iranian leaders used this moment not to retreat, but to build. Strategic industries like nuclear technology, drones, missile defense, and even space exploration saw unprecedented growth under pressure. And what was once viewed as a nation dependent on the world slowly transformed into a country that learned how to stand on its own feet, even while being pushed to the ground. Sanctions may have slowed Iran's economy, but they failed to break its will. That's the part the architects of pressure never understood. When you come for a nation built on faith, pain doesn't always lead to surrender. Sometimes it leads to rebirth. Iran became a living example of that, and in the face of constant suffocation, it chose not to beg, not to kneel, but to rise with a quiet, unshakable strength that no currency collapse or trade ban could ever touch. Faith is not just a private matter in Iran. It is the foundation of the nation's identity, the force that holds its people together when the world tries to tear them apart. In times of war, in moments of isolation, and during the most brutal economic hardship, it is not weapons or wealth that have sustained Iran, but a spiritual backbone rooted in centuries of belief. From the mosques of Qom to the streets of Tehran, faith is more than ritual, it's resilience. It teaches sacrifice, instills duty, and builds a collective consciousness that no amount of external pressure can erase. This is a country that rose from the ashes of monarchy through a revolution that wasn't fought just with slogans, but with the conviction that divine justice must replace foreign domination and tyranny. That revolution was not just political, it was spiritual. It awakened a nation that believed it had a God-given right to self-determination, dignity, and independence. During the Iran-Iraq War, when the world watched silently as cities were bombed and chemical weapons fell on civilians, it was faith that filled the trenches. Young men didn't charge the front lines for medals or money. They walked into fire with verses of the Quran on their lips and the dream of martyrdom in their hearts. Their mothers didn't just mourn their loss. They celebrated it as sacrifice in the path of something greater than life. This kind of belief is incomprehensible to those who measure strength only in tanks and dollars. But in Iran, faith is the reason people get up in the morning, the reason they keep fighting when the world calls them isolated, and the reason they still see victory where others see only loss. This same faith has fueled the country's ability to innovate under pressure. Scientists see their work as service to the nation and obedience to a higher calling. Soldiers treat defense as worship. Even sanctions are seen as a test, a divine challenge to be overcome, not by begging, but by building. Martyrdom, patience, resistance. These aren't just religious terms in Iran. They are national pillars. And because of that, the country has managed to endure the kind of pressure that would have broken most nations long ago. Iran's political identity may evolve, its policies may shift, but its spiritual core remains untouched. That core whispers through generations. Never kneel, never surrender, never forget who you are. The world may not understand it, superpowers may try to suppress it, but that's what makes it unbreakable. When a nation is built not just on soil, but on faith, every hardship becomes a chapter in a divine test, and every triumph a testimony to the power of belief. This is why Iran, despite all odds, still stands, not just as a state, but as a spirit that refuses to bow. Iran has never just seen itself as a country with borders. It sees itself as a story, a voice, a symbol of defiance in a world that often punishes those who refuse to obey. When the world turned its back, when bombs fell and sanctions tightened like a noose, Iran didn't only respond with missiles and speeches. It responded with meaning. It began to craft a narrative, one that told its people and the rest of the world, we do not kneel, not because we can't, but because we won't. That story became its shield, its fuel, and its identity. In Iran, resistance is not only political, it is poetic. It is taught in schools, sung in songs, painted on walls, and echoed in the sermons of Friday prayers. The story of standing firm, even while bleeding, is deeply embedded in the national psyche. This narrative is drawn not only from recent history, but from a much older legacy of resistance. From the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala to the constitutional revolutions and anti-imperial struggles of the 20th century, Iran's soul has been shaped by a series of standoffs against injustice. These stories are not just remembered, they are relived. Every mother who sends her son to defend the country believes she's part of that sacred tradition. Every young person who endures economic hardship because of sanctions sees themselves as carrying the torch of generations that chose dignity over comfort. This belief that resistance itself is a form of victory has allowed Iran to turn suffering into strength. Its leaders have used every attack, every betrayal, every form of pressure as proof that they are on the right path. This isn't weakness disguised as strength. It's a strategy deeply rooted in identity. Iran did not collapse under war, nor under sanctions, because it chose to define its survival not in economic terms, but in moral ones. To kneel would be to betray that identity. And when a nation wraps its survival around an unshakable idea, that idea becomes armor that even the strongest armies cannot pierce. In literature, film, and education, this idea of resistance has been glorified not for political gain alone, but to build a psychological fortress that outlives politicians and outlasts policy. It's why the youth of today, born after the revolution and war, still chant the same slogans with conviction. They are not just repeating words, they are inheriting a narrative that tells them who they are and why they must never bow. Iran's greatest weapon has never been its missiles. It has been its story. A story written in the ink of struggle and sealed with the belief that even if the world comes to crush them, there is honor in standing alone. And when you turn your pain into purpose, your suffering into story, and your resistance into identity, you become something far more dangerous than an army. You become unbreakable. Iran's refusal to kneel before global superpowers is not just a political stance. It is a calculated and conscious decision, rooted in self-respect and long-term vision. In a world where many nations have folded under pressure, signed away their sovereignty or traded their values for temporary relief, Iran stands out as a country that continues to say no, even when the cost is high. It is paid in blood, in currency, in isolation, but it has never paid with its dignity. That refusal to bow has earned it both fierce enemies and reluctant respect. For some, Iran is a problem. For others, it is proof that a nation can resist the tide of global domination and still survive. And not just survive, but shape the conversation. On the global stage, Iran's position is unique. It doesn't follow the script written in Western capitals. It doesn't seek approval from global institutions that it believes are biased or manipulated. Instead, it writes its own script and speaks its own language, often alone, but never silent. Whether in the halls of the United Nations or on the battlefield of narratives, Iran positions itself as the voice of the voiceless, the defender of the oppressed, the challenger of empire. This self-pia is not just propaganda, it's a doctrine. It influences foreign policy, military strategy, and even cultural expression. Iran's alliances reflect this vision. Rather than aligning with global hegemons, it builds relationships with nations and movements that share its anti-imperial posture. From Latin America to Africa, from Palestine to Lebanon, Iran positions itself as a supporter of resistance, not subjugation. It doesn't pretend to be perfect. It knows it has internal struggles, economic flaws, and political challenges. But on the question of foreign domination, it remains unwavering. It would rather suffer than submit. That defiance sends a message not only to its enemies, but to every small nation watching from the sidelines, wondering if standing up is still possible in a world that often punishes independence. This posture also comes with a price. Iran has been labeled, sanctioned, and attacked in countless ways. Its people have suffered under intense economic and diplomatic warfare. But even then, the state has not shifted its fundamental stance. It continues to invest in defense, develop its own technologies, and refuse compliance with demands that it sees as unjust. Its leaders, regardless of faction or personality, hold a shared understanding that bowing down would not only be a political loss, it would be a betrayal of everything the country has endured and everything it stands for. And so Iran remains, not isolated but defiant, not submissive but sovereign. In a world where bending the knee is often the easier path, Iran chooses the harder road. Because for Iran, independence isn't negotiable. It is the very soul of the nation. And that soul has been tested by fire, tempered by war, and strengthened by faith. They tried to crush Iran, but instead, they reveal what a nation truly becomes when it refuses to surrender. They tried everything: coups, sanctions, war, isolation. They came with tanks, with lies, with dollars and promises, but they forgot one thing. Iran is not just a land of mountains and oil. It's a land of memory, of martyrdom, of unshakable faith. They thought breaking the economy would break the people. They thought fear would silence generations. But what they witnessed instead was a nation that bled but never bowed. A nation that turned every attack into a lesson, every loss into a legacy. Iran wasn't built on convenience. It was built on conviction. And conviction doesn't collapse, it grows stronger under pressure. This isn't just the survival of a state, it's the survival of spirit. You can crush borders, but you can't crush belief. You can threaten leaders, but you can't intimidate a people who see resistance as an act of worship. That's why Iran still stands. That's why it never knelt. And that's why it never will. Thank you for staying with me till the very end. In a world full of noise, confusion, and spin, you chose to listen deeply, and that matters. May this message stay with you not just as information, but as inspiration. Whatever you're facing in life, remember, pressure doesn't define you, your faith does. Stand firm, stay true, and never kneel to what you know is wrong. Good luck and thank you. The world needs more people like you.